Mazal tov to all of you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. It's such a privilege to be learning with all of you. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the role of the Beit HaMikdash for the Jewish people in ancient times, and in particular during the era before the rabbinic period, the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, which begins in around 515 BCE and of course ends in 70 CE with the fall of the temple at the hands of the Romans. And the question that I'm going to be asking in my little bit of time is more narrow than simply what did Jews think of the temple, but I want to ask whether they went on pilgrimage. And the reason why I want to ask this question is because the role of the temple, as it's laid out in the Torah, presumes a society that is living in the land of Israel. So if you look at passages in Shemot and in Devarim and elsewhere, there's a presumption that the society that centers around the temple is a society that is in proximity to it. I'm going to share my screen just so that you see some of these sources. Hold on a second. Okay, so now you should see some of these sources. And if anyone is interested, I would be glad to email this to you because you will see this is a 7-page source sheet, and I will not even skim the surface of what is in the source sheet. So don't stress. In the Torah, the notion of visiting the Beit HaMikdash is not simply a recommendation, it's a mandate. The Torah tells the Israelites that they have to go on pilgrimage to the land to bring sacrifices. And here I have a little tasting menu of some of those references to the mitzvah. These aren't the only ones, but you can see it's very unequivocal. Shalosh regalim tachog li bashana, shalosh pa'ami bashna yireh kol zechorcha el pnei Adon Adonai. And you can look at the second source that I have in Devarim. It's almost identical. Shalosh pa'ami bashana yireh kol zechorcha et pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar, and so on. Now, that is all well and good in the first temple period. In fact, you can learn a lot from the books of the Nevi'im about the way in which pilgrimage to Jerusalem from various areas of the northern and southern kingdoms were kind of barometers for an Israelite's or a Judahite's piety. Whether you went on pilgrimage was a major determinant regarding whether the prophets considered you to be in right relationship with God. But the reality becomes much more complicated after the exile at the hands of Babylonians when the temple falls in 586 BCE. And Judahites, of course, the northern Israelite kingdom is long gone, but the southern Judahites are expelled eastward towards the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. They are kicked out from their land. And when this happens, of course, the exile lasts up until 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, conquers Babylon and issues an edict to the Judahites who have been in exile, permitting them to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild their temple. This is actually the beginning of a major theological crisis because in the exilic period, Jews cannot go back to the land. And so there's kind of there's no theoretical discourse about, you have an option to go back to the land and you're choosing not to. That crisis really only happens after the edict of 538 BCE, when now Judeans are allowed to go back to the land of Israel and they can rebuild their temple, and the majority of them choose to stay right where they are or to move westward but not go back to the land of Israel. And so the beginning decades of the Second Temple era are really decades of theological crisis, because as 42,000 or so Judeans do return to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple and begin reinstituting the sacrifices, the vast majority, hundreds of thousands of Jews, do not go back. And these Jews are not assimilated Jews. They are observant, they are keeping their ancestral traditions, and they now have a new modality of worship, and that is the Torah. They don't feel the need necessarily to go back to the land of Israel in order to feel connected to their traditions. And so they find other ways to build communities, to maintain a sense of cohesion. They gather together regularly to read their Torah and to interpret it. And pilgrimage becomes an exercise of the elite. Pilgrimage is dangerous for many. It's expensive. It takes time. So if you have the means and the courage and the commitment, you might go on pilgrimage. But the reality is that probably most Jews in the Second Temple era do not go on pilgrimage. I'm going to show you a few sources that are not cohesive. In other words, they're a little bit contradictory, and I think that that's what makes them fun. But we're going to look at some sources about pilgrimage that comes from the Second Temple era. And I'm going to begin with a fictional source. It's a novella, a very, very popular novella from the late 3rd century BCE. It's called Tobit, Tovia. It's the Tobiad family was a real family in the Second Temple period. They were a priestly family, very well respected. And this novella probably is not a historical archive, but what's interesting about this novella, which is set in the 8th century BCE, but it's written in the 3rd century BCE, is that the protagonist, Tobit, describes himself as a pious person who, above all, made the pilgrimage from Nineveh because he was from the northern Israelite kingdom and his family was expelled from the northern Israelite kingdom by the Assyrians. And yet, nevertheless, he figured out a way to go to Jerusalem regularly for the festival. So again, a Jewish writer in the 3rd century BCE is writing in the land of Israel in Hebrew this novella that is set 500 years earlier, in the wake of the Assyrian expulsion of the northern Israelite kingdom. And we read, I, Tobit, walked in the ways of truth and righteousness all the days of my life. I performed many acts of charity. I alone went to Jerusalem for the festivals as it is prescribed for all Israel. So this tells us two things. On the one hand, Tobit is saying that pilgrimage is possible and reflective of great piety, but the fact that he alone does it gives us a little hint that probably most Jews were not making that trek. Although again, the question here is, we have a fictional novella from the 3rd century BC. Is this historical evidence? I would say this is really interesting, and it's a nice little, snippet into what a 3rd century BCE Jew from the land of Israel would have imagined life was like back in the olden days. It's not really historical evidence. To find maybe more firm ground when it comes to what Jews were actually doing in the late Second Temple era, we have to go to, I wouldn't call them historians, but we have to go to Jews who are writing about the realities of their own day. And for this, we have two really interesting sources that, unfortunately for us, are contradictory. The early 1st century CE philosopher Philo of Alexandria and the late 1st century CE historian Flavius Josephus. The 1st century philosopher Philo, who comes from Hellenistic Egypt, again, he lives in Alexandria, which is the crown jewel of the Hellenistic world. It's a place where hundreds of thousands of Jews live in the 1st century. He is not assimilated. He might be Hellenized, but that's not the same as being assimilated. He is a practicing Jew who kept Shabbat and Kashrut and dietary Shabbat, Kashrut, and Brit Milah. Those are the three main identifying markers of Jewish practice in the ancient world. And Philo tells us that Jews indeed traveled from all over the world regularly to visit and see their majestic Jerusalem temple. And I have to read this with you because it is just such an astonishing source. He's writing probably in the 30s or 40s CE, in the last decades of the Second Temple era. And he says, Moshe, well, he says he, but he's talking about the writer of the Torah, Moshe, does not consent to give those who wish to perform the rites in their houses. In other words, he doesn't allow private bamot, he doesn't allow private sacrifices, but he bids the Israelites to rise up from the ends of the earth and come to the temple in Jerusalem. In this way, Moshe applies the severest test to their dispositions, for one who is not going to sacrifice in their spirit would never bring himself to leave his country and his friends and his kinfolk and sojourn to a strange land. Clearly, it must be the stronger attraction of piety which leads him to endure separation from his most familiar and dearest friends. And so we have this very unambiguous representation of pilgrimage as being kind of international. Countless multitudes from countless cities come, some over land, others by sea, from east and west and north and south. I mean, this is poetic, but also, I think, an incredible image of Jews streaming to Jerusalem. They take the temple for their port as a haven and refuge from the bustle and turmoil of life. Like many philosophers of the 1st century, Philo hated the city. For him, the city is corrupting. So these people are leaving the corruptive forces of the city and they're traveling to this idyllic temple. Of course, it's in another city. There they seek to find calm weather and release from the cares whose yoke has been heavy upon them from their earliest years, to enjoy a brief breathing space in scenes of genial cheerfulness. Filled with comfortable hopes, they devote their leisure as is bound to duty to holiness and the honoring of God. Now, this is stunning. I think it's gorgeous. However, if I'm imagining hundreds of thousands of Jews coming to Jerusalem and they're bringing sacrifices, and I'm imagining the crowds and the mess and the smells, the noise, this does not feel historically accurate. It's gorgeous, but just imagine the smells of sacrifices. I'm sure that this has occurred to you before. Again, the crowds. To what extent is Philo imagining the ideal version of what a shalosh, what the shalosh regalim should have looked like versus what actually took place? We cannot know, but it does not seem to scholars that Philo actually made a pilgrimage himself. In fact, he only sees the temple once in his life, and probably not on a holiday. So I want to set this up against another source, and that is Flavius Josephus, who unlike Philo, is born in the proximity of Jerusalem. He comes from a priestly family, surely witnessed firsthand what it was like to live in the vicinity of Jerusalem during the time of the Second Temple. He's born in the 30 CE. He dies in the late 90 CE. And Josephus, in his third book of his 20-volume work, Antiquities of the Jews, describes at great length all the various kinds of sacrifices that Jews were bringing to the temple. This is a huge passage that I cite here, and I'm going to skip all of it. But again, if you're interested in this, please send me an email and I'll send you my source sheet. I included it here because you can see the extent to which Josephus is intimately familiar with the laws of the sacrifices in a way that Philo probably is not. So he just goes on and on about the different kinds and the chatat, and he also distinguishes between private and public and different kinds. It's fascinating. We're not going to do it now, but he's erudite when it comes to the laws of the sacrifices. And there must be scholarship comparing this with later rabbinic literature, but I'm not going to go into that now. What I want you to see is how Josephus describes pilgrimage in the fourth book of Antiquities of the Jews, where he says something that's totally different from Philo, and you have to pay close attention. He says, "Let those that live even as remote as the bounds of the land, which the Hebrews shall possess, come to that city where the temple shall be 3 times in the year, that they may give thanks to God." And then he says the same kind of thing about how it brings people together and they come in friendship. It's a good thing for those that are of the same stock, not to be unacquainted with each other. They converse, they see, they talk, they renew the memories of their union. It's kind of like summer camp. You go on the Shalosh Regalim, you see your old friends. And if they do not thus converse together continually, they will appear like mere strangers of one another. So the experience of pilgrimage is one that keeps the Jews together. But notice that for Josephus, pilgrimage is not an international enterprise. It is only for Jews who live as remote as the bounds of the land. According to how Josephus retells the biblical mandate of pilgrimage, it only applies to Jews within the land. Now, there are 2 ways to interpret Josephus. You could either say, well, of course, this is what Josephus is saying, because he's interpreting a biblical mandate that presumes that only Jews are living in the land. But you could also say Josephus, writing for Jews of his own day in the first century, believes that according to the Torah, only Jews within the land of Israel are obligated to make pilgrimage, even in a reality where Jews are living elsewhere. We don't know. But Josephus is very careful to repeat in other passages that pilgrimage is only for Judean Jews. And we have a very powerful and disturbing description where this comes up again, and that is when Josephus talks about the siege of 70 CE, right before the temple falls. Josephus talks about the siege of Jerusalem, which according to him begins on Pesach. And the reason why it's catastrophic, according to Josephus, is because there are 1.1 million pilgrims in the city. That's what Josephus tells us. He says 97,000 Judeans are taken captive in the war. The majority of them are not from Jerusalem. They had come from elsewhere in the country. So he says the number that were taken captive was 97,000, not belonging to the city itself, for they were come up from all the country for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they're not non-Judean Jews. They are Judean Jews, but they're not Jerusalemite Jews. So now, again, we have 2 images of pilgrimage. We have pilgrimage being a Judean enterprise, according to Josephus, and we have pilgrimage being an international Jewish enterprise. Now, it's very hard to know which is the correct source, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. What I think is very interesting is that both Josephus and Philo describe pilgrimage as something that brings the Jewish people together, and something that inspires friendship and closeness, and almost in a way takes God out of the picture. Obviously, there's a spiritual and religious benefit to pilgrimage, but there's also something very collegial and very social about pilgrimage. in my remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about some material evidence that we have about pilgrimage. I'm going to skip this whole section, but again, I'm very happy to send the source sheet to anyone who's interested. This section, called What About Those Who Stayed Home, is a section that argues that even those Jews who did not make pilgrimage, which I think is probably 98% of Jews in the so-called diaspora, these Jews felt psychically, they felt spiritually connected to their homeland, to Jerusalem, to their temple. And we know this from Roman sources and from Jewish sources. We know this from all kinds of material and literary evidence that tells us that Jews were sending what is the equivalent of billions of dollars to the temple. Cicero in the year 59 BCE gives a very impassioned speech to the Roman Senate, arguing to prohibit the export of Jewish gold to Jerusalem because the Jews were sending so much money to Jerusalem. And the punishment that Rome metes out to the Jews after the war for their rebellion is a punishment that that kind of mocks the Machatzit HaShekel and forces all Jews throughout the Roman Empire to send money to the temple of Jupiter, because these Jews had been sending money to the Jerusalem temple, and that was considered to be traitorous. It was considered to be seditious to the Roman Empire. So these are some interesting sources about the huge sums of money that Jews who did not make pilgrimage sent to Jerusalem. But here's where I want to close. I want to close with material evidence. How can we know who's right? Is it Philo, who suggests that pilgrimage was common for all Jews wherever they lived? Or is it Josephus, who suggests that Jews who lived far beyond the boundaries of the land of Israel did not go on pilgrimage and didn't have to go on pilgrimage? So the truth is that we can't know, but there are 2 points of material evidence that I want to close with that I think are very interesting. The first one is not on the source sheet. It is the fact that there are pilgrimage paths that have been discovered by modern archaeologists, paths that are not so wide that they can accommodate a Roman chariot, but not so narrow that they're intended for one person to walk. They are family paths. And these paths that have been excavated by archaeologists come from all 4 directions. And archaeologists believe that these were paths for Jewish families to come as units to Jerusalem to bring sacrifices on the Shalosh Regalim. And there's really interesting scholarship on that. You can look up if you subscribe to Biblical Archaeology Review. And I can also, I'm always happy to send you some sources on this. But again, these are pilgrimage paths that have been recently discovered that lead to Jerusalem. And the second and final material source that I want to show you comes from this fascinating 1st century CE inscription that was found by scholars in recent years in Jerusalem. And this is known as the Theodotus inscription. This reads as follows. Theodotus, he was the son of a priest, an archisynagogos, which means the head of a synagogue in Greek. He built the synagogue in Jerusalem for the reading of the law in Greek, that is nomos, which actually means Torah. So for the reading of the Torah and for the teaching of commandments, and he built the strangers' lodging as an inn for those that need it from abroad. So, and by the way, the word abroad is not diaspora, it's not diaspora, it's xene, which doesn't mean, it's not exactly diaspora, it means abroad, so it actually could be a Jew up in the north within the boundaries of the land of Israel. In other words, abroad doesn't mean outside the land of Israel. So this is a tricky source. What does it mean, xene? What does it mean abroad? It could mean foreign land, but it could also mean just far away. But what's fascinating about this source is that it's Greek. You have a Greek inscription on a synagogue in Jerusalem in the 1st century, intended obviously for Greek-speaking Jews. So would it make sense for this inscription to be referencing Jews who are coming from Tiberia or from anywhere in the Galilee, right? These are Jews coming from Greek-speaking lands, probably from Hellenistic Egypt and elsewhere where Jews were speaking Greek and not Aramaic or Hebrew. My assumption is still that the majority of Jews in the diaspora did not go on pilgrimage. Nevertheless, I do believe that the idea of pilgrimage was incredibly powerful for Jews, even for Jews who never saw the temple in their entire life. The idea of pilgrimage was a value system. It was a sense of connection. And this value system is manifest, of course, in later rabbinic literature and in the liturgy that we still say today. And I think that this is why Masechet Zevachim is so very important and powerful, as Rabbanit Michelle so beautifully said at the end of her talk. Zevachim reminds us of the centrality of the Beit HaMikdash in Jewish life, even for Jews who never in their whole life saw the Beit HaMikdash. And I think that this value is really about the desire the intense desire to be close with God, to be close with one another, and to come together and serve God in unity and with pleasure. So thank you very much, and Mazal Tov.